Okay, back at it. New number 4. I did that before.
I'm sorry.
I declared we were in open session and I declared a 10-minute recess.
Oh, thank you.
You guys were already on your way out.
Yeah, well,
Mr. Chad, can you tell me what
Anarchy.
time you did that,
10 minutes ago. 6:50. We've just concluded our 10-minute recess. We are back to Board of Education rules and responsibilities for hiring, termination, and contracts. It's important for us to determine how we would like to set up how the board sees or hires. Who has that authority, whether it's granted to the superintendent, and if we want to decide at varying levels of position, whether the board's involved to this position, or, so I'll open it up to discussion. Yes, absolutely.
I would like to open up the discussion by saying I would like to keep what I perceive as how this board has gone about making all hires done in the 6.5 years based on what my perception has always been the way we do it. The only problem is the board doesn't really seem to be in agreement, I believe, with the superintendent on where those lines are. So I think we need to determine what we actually have now before we decide if we want to make any changes to what is presently in existence.
Okay, what is your perception of what we currently have that you would like to keep?
My perception is that the superintendent, whatever the position is, has the responsibility, and we give her, she has the statutory responsibility, she has the implicit authority and contractual authority to go out, do the interview process, determine what positions need to be filled, and then she brings that position, once she has her agreement of who she wants to hire, she brings it before the board on the monthly basis. That's one of the reasons why I always wanted to have bi-monthly meetings, so we could actually do consent agendas twice a month for whatever positions she may or may not need to fill or hire or fire. And long as she knows that the amount of involvement the board members may or may not want is not really relevant as to what our ultimate legal authority is, which is at the end of the day either consent or reject who she brings forward. It's,
Right, so
I think it's a good system.
Right.
And the reason why
I just wanted to recap.
Okay.
Just so you want to keep, because there's state statute and there's an implicit directive of the board that the superintendent determines what positions there are that need to be filled, conducts interviews through whatever procedure they do, whether be it a committee or be it through HR if it's a posted job. And then they bring that recommendation of a finalist to the board on a consent agenda.
Yes, and the board should also realize that the board, and I'm not positive the board's attorney agreed or disagreed, some districts actually allow the board to actually do the recommendation of the employee without the advice and consent of the superintendent. I thought that, I didn't think that was the way that the statute.
Well, the point is
well, no.
what do you want to do?
Oh, well, that's what I want to do it, but I mean,
how
the
other
board
districts
should know.
Yeah, but how other districts do it's totally irrelevant.
What?
We as a group have to decide how we want to do it, and you want to keep with the current system of the superintendent makes a recommendation and the board has to final yes or no through the consent agenda.
Yes, and.
Well, that's really kind of it.
Okay.
Do you want that to be unilaterally, or do you want it based on positions or bargaining?
I want it unilateral.
Okay.
No, I mean, I
All
want it
hiring.
all encompassing,
All
Yes.
hiring.
like we do now. Everybody comes before the board on the consent agenda.
Okay. All right. Paul?
I would like to see that, I mean, I think Cheryl is,
Well,
her role.
I
would
want to
like
talk general superintendent
Yes.
going forward, not
Okay, yeah.
necessarily current.
I think the superintendent is the hiring agent, okay?
Okay.
But I would like to see any, what I would consider district-wide positions, director of special ed, things like that, that board members be invited to those interviews. But I consider central administration positions,
Mhm.
that the board at least have an opportunity to be in on those interviews.
Which is how they do it.
That's how they currently.
That's fine,
They're
right,
interview
okay.
committee.
I haven't been here when we've hired,
Well, yeah.
except for special ed now.
Right.
So I think a good start is gonna be, we need to develop this hierarchy, right? Of the non-bargaining unit employees. Because we want, because I don't know that everybody wants to be involved with everything from the bottom of that hierarchy all the way to
Well-
the top, right?
Well, what Andrew's proposing is, the way it's currently done
Mhm.
is, if it's, every position in the district is in our consent agenda. All the way from coaching appointments to teachers to administrators, it's all covered in the consent agenda. And that's where we vote yes or no.
Right.
And that's been that way forever. So, I mean, the superintendent does the interview, makes the recommendation, and brings it in. In the recent past, superintendents have asked board members to be part of search committees. And it gets put out to the board, if anybody wants to volunteer to get in on a search committee, then they get in on it. Now, that's not really identified anywhere, that's just been a practice,
An
which we
interview.
could identify.
And interview.
An
committees.
interview and search, I'm sorry, I meant the search/interview committee.
Right.
Now, we could identify that, if we want to identify that we want to be in those positions in the hierarchy such as you're referring to. If that's what you'd like to recommend.
Yes.
Yours
You said it
was-
better.
Yours was much shorter.
You said it better.
All right. Ellen, you have anything? We're bebopping across the tables.
I like how it is now. I would like a hierarchy also, but with the upper management positions only.
So you wanna create a
To be
line,
involved.
just
I would
it's
like to
this or it's
create a
that.
line, yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
Okay.
what that line is,
Discuss.
I have just a question, if we put that in, you know, we've had a lot of problems in the last couple of months, not getting enough people to attend exposure hearings. So if we put this in and we can't find a board member to do it, what happens? I guess
Nothing.
they can't interview because.
No, they can, this is just voluntary. I
No,
mean,
but
if
you're
a
talking
board,
about the hierarchy.
yeah,
If we set it up that we have board members
Oh.
involved in that process and we can't get board
true,
members.
true,
No.
true, Fiona.
Right, yeah.
no, I don't think.
I mean, I
How
think
about
we
just
have
that
to
it must
make
be
a policy
Your
and not
system doesn't
follow
have
it.
that. in
Right,
it.
if
There-
I
So-
want to be
That's why I
involved
said
in the
invite them.
process, I want to.
Right, but we can develop a policy where it says it can be offered rather than, like we said, it can be offered rather than will.
Right, but then
So-
here's how I visualize, I'm a realist, this is how
Yeah.
I visualize it happening. Nobody can attend the interviews for whatever reason. We don't participate, comes to the board for the consent agenda. We're not gonna hire them because the board wasn't part of the interviews. Well, the board wasn't part of the interviews because the board chose not to go to the interviews. So I'm just
Yeah, good
concerned
point.
about the
Good point.
exposure and, you know, we have had a lot of problems with
Well, I would-
participation.
Yeah, I would think it would be very difficult for us to hire. Well, maybe I better think about it before I say it, never mind.
Well, the thing is too, we're approving the superintendent, right? Whoever that superintendent is. We're doing that based off of the fact that we trust that we've made a good hire in that particular position. So we are also saying that we have confidence in that individual to assess these people for these positions.
Correct.
That's
So,
how I feel.
Right.
I'm
So
not
it's-
happy with the superintendent, I'm gonna address it with the superintendent, because she's our employee.
right,
Right.
but I
As an
think this,
individual.
as an individual, she's.
As a-
No,
she
as
is
an
whoever
individual,
we
you're
are.
gonna address it, but not as a board collective.
No, as a board,
No.
my feeling is, we only have responsibility for the superintendent, not just you, whoever the superintendent is.
Right.
So
But I
if
think
they
it's-
hire somebody that doesn't belong in a position or isn't qualified, then the board deals with the superintendent
Right.
on that issue.
Right, but I think it's nice that the superintendent asks if a board member
yeah.
wants to be involved in like the upper level.
Right, I just don't wanna tie it
Positions.
to a mandatory process.
Agreed.
Because I don't believe okay, another half day, you gotta take at work because you have to be at Midgeon at 2:00 because no one else can come.
Yeah.
I mean, it's, I wish it were different, but it's not. So,
Right.
Well, and I think,
So then when we develop the policy, that can be,
Right, we gotta at least offer
Part
the
of it.
opportunity for the transparency of having the board being a part of that, if we as a group so choose,
right.
right?
Yeah, that's perfect. It's the transparency of an opportunity,
Correct.
whether or not the board
If we take
wants to or
advantage,
not. Right, it's.
We do, if we don't, we don't.
but I don't believe we should delay the hire if the
Correct.
board doesn't take advantage of the
Right, because we're taking away the
transparency.
flexibility of the superintendent to fill positions that
All right, we're going
are
on
obviously
to
needed, right?
I just want a delineation of, like, so we're talking about hiring and the superintendent's ability to appoint and doing it through the consent agenda. Technically, like, when we're renewing the contract, so the superintendent presents the contract, because it is a one-year contract, we're rehiring the person for a year. Are we gonna delineate, we as a board go through, at least right now, and approve the recommendations. But I just wanna delineate, we're talking about new hires going through the consent agenda, are we running the contracts through the consent agenda? Because if you look at that as hiring, we would run that through the consent agenda based on what everybody just said.
If it's a one-year contract and it runs out, then you are hiring a person.
We already
Right,
do
and
it.
so we're talking about the hiring process, and I wanna make sure that we know what we're saying.
Because contracted people, you're bargaining agents, you don't wanna go through 400+ teachers and 300+ non-certified.
Right.
Right, that's, I just wanna make sure that we're
Right,
delineating
right,
all
right.
this.
So your recommendation is that there be a delineation between affiliated and non-affiliated?
everybody's voting. On the ground.
Chris, do you have anything? Yes.
The board looks at through committee or individually anyway, all of our employees' contracts. So to me, it would make sense that we would look at the 10 non-bargaining unit contracts as a board. And to the extent that we haven't done that as thoroughly as we wish to do now in the past, I think we should make that our explicit policy, that we're going through every single contract and everyone knows about it, so that there's no argument or confusion down the road. So that's different than what we're talking about, the hierarchy. To me, these are two different issues. I'm kind of with
Right,
Carl
right.
on this. And I would like to see an invitation for anyone who is a building level or a building level administrator or above. So not any APs, but it would be the director of secondary ed, or if you ever went back to a principal of the high school, middle school, any elementary principal, that we just be invited.
Yes.
Those are pretty, I don't think I'd like to extend it just beyond central office. Director of secondary ed's a really big public position, for example.
Could I ask Chris a question?
I don't know. Chris, do you want him to ask?
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Those 10 contracts, are you?
Or however many they are.
Whatever they are.
Yeah.
Are you saying the board would see those contracts before they were offered? And
Correct.
approve them
So
before they're
if
offered?
they expire in June, I would think we'd have to be done looking at them through whatever committee has cognizance over April, so that way the board can be in agreement in May, so that it can be offered in June.
Oh, so it's part of the budget too.
I would think you'd have to move that up because.
Or even, but I mean, so that
60-day
there's a
notice.
timeline.
For your 60-day notice in a contract, I think the board should have them approved prior to that. That's all.
But don't we also have to decide if we want to do contracts?
Yep.
Yes.
Or is it just gonna be a written notice?
But, okay, so
Right, or
anytime there is a
notification.
contract, how about that? Anytime there is a contract, we have to see it ahead of time. That it's not going to be, the consent agenda is the first time. you see it.
The superintendent has to provide, her recommendation of the contract to us ahead of time.
Maybe at the committee level, so you can, because
Okay.
I don't wanna negotiate against you, Cheryl. Do you know what I'm saying? You're negotiating the contract, but if there's something that's questionable or we feel strongly about, then it's not, the time to have it is not when all the people are sitting there.
And would it be,
Right.
would it be, budget, or is it personnel?
Personnel, right?
Personnel.
Well, the dollar amount.
No,
is-
dollar amount was budget,
No,
And-
con-
But the
contracts-
contract
Contracts for
itself is-
employment goes with personnel.
Right.
but.
As far as where it fits in the budget is budgetary, but the contracts themselves go to personnel to the board.
The non-bargaining.
Non-bargaining.
Non-bargaining unit, individual contracts.
So we need to decide if we as a board want to have contracts or no contracts, or give the superintendent the authority to have
Let's just
contracts or
finish the
non-contracts.
last two that haven't chimed in on the general, and then we'll drill it down. John, what is your opinion?
Well, recognizing that we have the unresolved issue of whether or not to add contracts at all, I agree with what Chris has said. I think he's comprehensively put it together.
Dan?
I can't see any fault with either Chris or Carl or anybody else in what they're looking to do. I mean, basically, ultimately, the 10 of us that sit at this table are responsible to the taxpayers, so the contract should be run through us, as that is a financial matter, and that is the future burden for the community. That is our job. But as far as hiring the people and whatnot, administrative level and above for principal, central office, I can see that as running through as a search committee with board members as part of that. But below that level, no. I mean, that's not something that, again, we have 10 members, we all have jobs, or are retired and want to enjoy ourselves.
But I wouldn't want to discourage the superintendent from involving board members if he or she thinks that's appropriate, as for
Correct.
instance, the interviews we had this week. You thought it was appropriate to have board
It was
members
very
involved in
important for the
that.
board.
And I think it
felt
was,
that
I
position.
agree.
Well, we would only be setting a minimum, not a maximum. It wouldn't be, we're only here. We would expect to be included in this, but you could always offer more.
What we can do,
For
I'm just saying,
specialized
we can
positions.
put it out there. You know, this is when the hiring dates, you know, we'll already
Use
figure the
this week as
structure
an
out.
example. You had a tag teacher, you had a library media specialist. I don't really think that it was necessary to have the board involved in hiring the library media specialist for an elementary school, but the tag teacher is a district-wide employee that covers all the kids. You know, I think the library media specialist is a very finite position that's existed, and, you know, that's just, you have the qualifications, the certification to do that, or you don't. And as far as the tag teacher, you know, we're, as a board, looking to expand a program or, you know, keep a program. There is a lot more involvement in a board mindset. But,
Well, and it also helps if there's a discussion on the candidate, that two of us can speak to.
yes, absolutely.
The credentials of that candidate.
Now, would it be, oh, sorry.
Would it be possible for us to have like a, I'll say an ad hoc, but the way it works right now, we have a committee that does administrative negotiations, a committee that does, you know, TEA, a committee that does certified. Could you have a committee that just works on the non-bargaining unit contracts so that the superintendent would, you know, have a person to kind of run things by, and then that committee would then bring it to the board, similar to you do after you do negotiations.
One would assume.
I would just think, and I don't, I'm sorry, I didn't mean
Well,
to,
it's
that
just-
personnel would be the best to go through
Committee.
only because it's a standing committee. Or you're saying just to sit in on the interviews?
Not, I'm talking just about the contracts.
Now, I would think personnel, I would think a standing committee should have that, because then what happens,
We
you know,
have a
quorum
standing
issues.
Would it be safe for us to start at this point and say that all bargaining unit positions, we would like, that all bargaining unit positions stay in the current format? Would it be safe to say that we want to keep that way?
As far as hiring and
As far as hiring, firing,
Yes.
right? Through the consent agenda, as recommendations that come forward through the superintendent's office? So we can take that part of the discussion off the table.
But a building level principal is part of a bargaining unit.
Right,
Or director, secondary, yes.
right.
But the only difference, there's no difference in approving it, it's just we want we want to
Right.
know when the interviews are gonna take place, so we can show up. if we
And
want.
whoever wants to show, shows.
Just, maybe you have the answer, or the board's attorney has the answer. So all 10 of us show up at this interview, are we now
A
in
meeting,
violation
yeah,
of having a
Has to be
meeting?
posted.
Yes.
So we always have to take into consideration that
Right.
no more than 4 members at any time can show up to.
We can never, we
Yeah,
can
we
never.
have trouble
get
getting
it.
Good- good luck.
What would that number be? If we don't have a
Less than a
standing
quorum.
committee, then it would be,
Less than a quorum.
so it would be
5
5 or less.
We always
Right.
ask for 4 because for big interviews, we have 2 separate processes, okay? And so the 2 board members are on the one with people from our leadership team, and then we have another administrator on the other team, which includes parents, teachers, and things like that.
Right. If we have 2 board members, we split them among the 2 rooms. If there's 4, they go 2 and 2. If there's
No, they
more than
stay
4,
together.
somebody goes home. I mean, you would just have to. There would have to be, you can't create a quorum, or they would have to disband the interview, so somebody would have to go home.
Yeah, if you have, I mean, under the FOI statute, if you have a quorum of either the full board or a committee that's been charged with some responsibility related to what's happening at the meeting. So for example, I mean, if you effectively have a committee of 3 people and you have 2 people at that gathering, then you have a meeting that's got to be posted.
Is that-
It's not just quorum of the board.
Is that of every committee or a committee that's relevant
Every
to that
interview committee, we
meeting?
have to post.
It's gotta be, every
If-
committee meeting has to be posted, except, with the one exception to that is collective bargaining. Whenever you have union negotiations, you can meet to discuss strategy, and you can also have the negotiations without, that they're not subject to the FOI statute at all in terms of the actual, those gatherings, I'm not gonna call them meetings. But when you have a committee meeting of your policy committee, your curriculum
Yeah.
committee.
No, we do
personnel
that, no,
committee.
Right.
I'm
But if we're
talking
doing it-
interviewing, if we're interviewing, that's not a committee. I mean, it becomes a committee because you have
Yes.
parents, teachers.
Well, no,
and-
if-
and-
But Paul and I are on the
It's not a
same,
committee of the board, though.
No,
but wait a minute, Paul and I are on the same committee. There's 3 of us on the committee. If both of us show up for interviews, that's a committee.
But are
Is
you
that what you're
acting-
saying?
Because 2
Are
of the
you
3
acting as a
showed.
private citizen that is a member of the board, or are you acting in your board responsibilities?
We're acting, the superintendent said, I'm invited to an interview, so I go, John goes. We're on the same committee. We're on policy.
And are you there,
So-
for my clarification? I'm
We're
sorry.
there for interview,
And are you there to participate or just observe?
participate in the interview.
But
So
if they're
we are
policy
considered,
committee-
but we're considered a committee because 2 of us are there, correct?
For policy, not for interview.
If you're functioning as a committee, either of the board or created by the board, that's subject to the FOI statute.
But if they're there is in the capacity of doing an interview, which has nothing to do with budget or policy, if 2 members of those subcommittees were there, would that be a quorum of that subcommittee? Because it has nothing to do with budget or policy.
I have a concern that you could be having a meeting of a committee under those circumstances.
Okay, so then we would have to structure, the superintendent invites a board member. And so the first one that responds,
What they've been doing is they send me the notification, or they send it to the board chair, because we're not talking about people. The board chair sends it out, and then the board chair would have to look at the subcommittees and make sure that they're not pulling 2 people that serve on a subcommittee of 3.
Or just say, I need 1 board member for interviews.
right, I need 1 board member. First one to respond,
Well, but no, but what Cheryl said before, sometimes those interviews are split. There are 2 groups interviewing the same candidates
with
in
different
rotation.
questions.
Yeah, so they wouldn't be meeting.
Right, so
So,
you 2 can't be in the same
I
room
need
together.
a board
Right,
member
that's basically
for
what-
this,
right?
and then I
What
need
Rick
a
just said
board
was
member
that-
for this.
Because we do it in 2 separate groups, if one was in each room with separate interview questions,
I think it'd be helpful if Jessica and I could get a further understanding at some point after tonight of what you're actually doing currently for your
Okay.
hiring process.
okay. So you're saying we should stop talking?
Well, I just think, I think we need to get a better understanding of what you're currently doing now.
Okay.
So
But
what's
I don't
the,
think we've really been involved, sorry.
Okay, so what's the downside of just posting the meeting and whatever board members?
Because when you post,
And the
then it's
candidates
open
are
to the
exposed.
public.
And we're trying to protect
And
these
then you're
people.
trying to
Right.
protect the
Right.
people you're interviewing, because
Right.
if they don't get the job,
I'm just,
I mean, it'll help. Recently, Mr. Leone went for an interview in Winchester for,
Involved at all.
a superintendent's position. He was recognized going in for the interview, and it was all over the paper. An administrator for a school district, or in a high-ranking position in a school district, you don't want people know you're looking for a job. It hurts you where you are, and it could negate your ability to get the job as to where you're interviewing.
are we correct on the law here? I mean, what they're saying as far as if you post a meeting and the entire board is eligible to show up, then the candidates their identity would have to be,
If you have let's assume the board had a search committee, the board appoints a 3-member search committee, and says, if other members of the board would like to show up, that's perfectly fine, you can show up, and all the board members show up. The FOI statute says that is not a board meeting, that is still a meeting of just the committee, as long as that wasn't the intention at the outset. You have to be obviously fully above board, as I'm sure you would be, but that is a meeting of that committee. If you're going to interview if that committee is going to interview that person, that can be done in executive session. It would have to be a posted meeting, it would be done in executive
No,
session.
this is the superintendent.
I understand, but that's why you have to be careful in terms of whether something, if it's simply the superintendent having an administrative process where candidates are interviewed, that is not necessarily subject to FOI requirements concerning posting. If the board's creating effectively, or by practice, or absolutely by motion, creating a working committee that's going to participate in interviews, then you may end up with something that's got to be posted under the FOI statute.
Yeah, no, we're not trying
No,
to form a
but-
committee, I don't think.
I understand.
But
This
you are
is-
forming a committee by having 2 members of a standing committee in the same place in an executive function.
But you're not acting in the capacity of the subcommittee that you're
But you're
on.
still 2 board
Still,
members.
yeah.
Right.
You create the subcommittee just by being together. Whether you intended to do it
I
or
think
not,
an
you
official
created
thing
that.
to
So
say.
if
Right.
6 of us get together for a golf outing and someone were to start talking about a board policy, it's a meeting. Because there's 6 of us. We're on a golf course. It doesn't matter where we are, we've just constituted a meeting because 6 of us are together. Unless they're all from the same political party and then it's a caucus and they get away with it. But that's the only, yes, Dan?
Does this caveat still hold effect even though we're in 2 separate rooms?
That
You're
was-
not together?
Well, what,
Something that's certainly there.
Okay.
what council asked was that we
Table the
work out,
discussion?
Yeah.
we work out the interview process format at another meeting and we just
Okay.
continue while they understand our current interview process.
Can I please continue interviews?
Nobody said you couldn't.
Just asking.
We're just not gonna talk about it anymore. Okay?
I just want to make sure.
Get that in
does the board member have the right to go into the building and say, you've got 5 candidates for teaching positions. I'd like to see, and you're hiring one, I'd like to see the resume of the 5 candidates. Do I have that right?
Not if we've decided the one that we're hiring. That will come
No,
before
no,
recommendation.
that's the whole issue, which is, I wanna be able to be informed somehow, either some board member shows up, or I have the ability to look at all the resumes and see who she's hiring, what type of hire she picks out of 5 people.
Let me see if I get it. We post a position, we get 24 applicants. The superintendent and the HR director refine it down to 1 to come before the board on a consent agenda. Does the board have the right to go and review the resumes of the 24 applicants?
No.
No?
Why
The
would
board-
we? That
The board members
undermines
are going to part of a search committee actively involved in screening applicants and the like, they'd have the right to do that. But ultimately, if their issue is limited to should John Smith be appointed as the whatever position we're filling, then the board members are gonna look at that resume, because that's the only person that's.
But I can go look, I can go and say, I'd like to see John Smith's resume 2 days before the meeting it's on the consent agenda.
Quite honestly, what should happen there is the board should have a uniform process where all board members get the information, the same information in the same way. So either ahead of time or at the meeting, but that should be all done in a uniform way.
So if we made a procedure that the people being recommended, that their application and resume are on file in the superintendent's office, and everyone is invited to come look at them, would a board member be allowed, would that be sufficient? Instead of sending them out to everybody, if you made it available and.
Yes, if the board members define that as the process, and that's limited to board members who are gonna have some say ultimately in whether to approve or not approve that appointment, yes, that's fine. Just so everyone understands, the names of all applicants and all identifying information about applicants, all that information is exempt from disclosure under the FOI statute. So to preserve the issue that Cheryl talked about, the fact that someone may be applying for a job but it's not known publicly, the only information that ultimately is disclosable are the credentials of the person who ultimately gets the job.
But as a board member voting
Correct.
before, I can see
Yes,
that
all-
person's,
yes, all I'm
whatever
saying-
paperwork that person submitted.
Yes, all I'm saying is that
Yeah.
should be done, from our perspective, it is best to do that in a uniform way, or make it available in a uniform way to all board
It would be in the superintendent's office in a folder, that one that's gonna go forward. Not everybody who applied for it.
Right, okay, I mean,
Right. That's,
So that would be part of it.
right.
Is that also,
That's-
would be available to anyone, or just board
no,
members?
no, if someone from the
Just those
outside, for
voting.
example, were to request it, they would not be able to get that. Even after the position's filled, any individualized information about unsuccessful applicants is subject to redaction.
Okay. I just want that to be clear.
Yes, yeah.
Would that information then be available before the agenda came out? That the person was gonna be on the consent agenda, or like what would the timing be?
Well, honestly, I think that's something for you to work out in terms of what works best for you. You're not, there's no statute that says you have to do it one way or the other. That's up to how you determine that to work best for you as a board. Whether you do it with the agenda, prior to the agenda, after the agenda, whatever works best.
I guess I'm trying to figure out, other than John and Paul, I'm not sure how any of us are qualified to determine if someone's qualified to teach English at the high school. I'm still trying to
We're
wrap
not.
my mind around that. So I just think it's
We're not.
micromanaging to the extent, and I don't think it's a road that this board or any future board should go down.
Well, except, I will say that someone who is not in the education field may have some very good questions.
But if you're not part of the interview
Because they're not
process,
informed.
right, but if you haven't been part of the interview process, you haven't been a part of anything,
No, I'm saying if you were part of the interview
come down here and look at the
process.
application.
Okay, you're talking about something different,
What
I'm
my
sorry.
vision is, they're working on stuff in the
Right.
superintendent's office, and people are walking in, oh, that English teacher at the high school, I wanna see who the finalist is, let me see the application, let me see the application for this, like they're, I don't know, to me, I just don't see how we're
Oh, I
qualified
thought you meant
to make
something
that
different.
decision.
We don't hire that many people, do we? I mean, it's gonna be a
We
big
hired
job.
41
Oh,
last
yeah.
year, last
All
summer.
right,
I'm sorry.
so that's good.
I think we should come up with a uniform process for board members to access the information of hires that are made for the consent agenda.
Yes.
I mean, I think that's something worth coming up with. However we wanna disclose it to board members, that's great, but I very rarely agree with Andrew, but I'm with him on this, that the board members should have the right to
And we
review
should set
that.
up a policy or a procedure of how that's gonna happen. And if a board member exercises their right to go down and see it, they can. If a board member does not exercise their right, the opportunity was there.
Right.
But
Because,
you
I mean,
only see credentials.
No,
The board member would not see the
No, you see the
name
whole thing.
of.
You see the whole deal.
whole deal.
We're
We
the
already know the
employer.
name.
You see the whole
It's
thing.
on the agenda.
Board member would see.
No, it's
it's
not
not.
gonna
We
be
don't know
on
the
the
name.
agenda.
No. If the
So I'm
consent, right,
misunderstanding?
hang on. If the consent agenda comes out, the resumes and the application for those people on that consent agenda would be in individual files in the superintendent's office if you chose to review them. Once the person is hired, only certain information is allowed out. You know, we're the voting, we would have access to the full documentation, but it would be done, again, in an executive session type thing. You wouldn't be able to take it out and share it. It's confidential information.
I don't think that's what Andrew was saying, though.
It could be anywhere. It could be in HR. She doesn't want it in her office.
Well, no, because.
I think what Andrew was
a lot.
asking was before it gets on the consent agenda.
And they said no.
No, did you say no?
He said the finalist has to be identified.
I think the superintendent has to be in a position where she's made her determination in terms of who she's going to recommend to the Board of Education. Once that has been finalized,
Right.
then the board can determine when and how board members should be.
Because you're the
And-
next step in the hiring
And
process.
see, I think that name, I think then, before you put it on the consent agenda, let the board members have that opportunity. So then you could,
Right.
then you have more of an idea, of all 10 of us.
Then it won't go on the consent agenda.
Exactly, so that's a
So-
piece.
Pending
but it has to
superintendent
happen here.
recommendation.
And then if we don't go look at it, we don't go look at it, but I'm just saying
Yeah.
that we all,
Okay.
and that's okay, right?
If they go this route, what happens if a board member leaks the name of one of these people?
Yeah, that's a good point. It has to be protected.
And
There's no reason,
Right, it
there's
will be.
no reason to know somebody's name at all. There's no reason.
There is reason.
There's not a reason.
No, because
you
Johnny
have an
goes to the grocery
application,
store,
you have an
this person
application
shouldn't have a job,
with
it's not a-
credentials. We're
And we
doing
had to do background
background checks and everything. It's candidate
You know-
A, B, C.
Ask about what happened down in Bridgeport and the credentials of those people that were running that school down there. They said that they had PhDs, they didn't, what?
That was a charter school, that wasn't public.
But it-
Well, it could, you know.
But they didn't do the
let's-
background
Oh, yeah, that
checks, we
was-
do background checks.
Right. So basically what you're saying is that the background checks are not, you don't have confidence in the background checks?
I'm an elected official, my
Okay,
position is to basically be skeptical of everything government employees do.
I missed that.
That is the bottom line.
I missed that in the bylaws.
Oh, what are you? You get a government check, don't you?
Nobody told me that when I got
So
elected.
as a clarification,
Yes.
to protect some of the board members that don't believe this information should be spread in Stop and Shop,
Absolutely right.
what protection do the rest of the board have that other board members are not gonna leak this information out, that we all have responsibility?
I think if we're gonna have
for the
access to
information
be able to see an individual's credentials, or background check, or whatever it is, that's fine. We absolutely do not have the right to know their name.
Well, we do have the right, unless the attorney says we don't have the right.
No, I'm just giving my opinion.
Well, I
I
mean,
don't feel
we
we
as a
have the
board-
right.
We
we
have
can-
the right
we-
to determine if we want to see the name.
Yeah, but
That's
in the
right.
way he phrases it, we don't have a right. We
That's my
have a
opinion.
right.
I don't feel we have that right.
Rights are not a matter of
No, 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 no,
opinion,
no.
rights are a matter of law.
Yeah, that's all I'm saying. We have, I mean, if we don't want
But what-
it, that would be our opinion not to do it, but we have a right to it.
But what the attorney said, if I
Sure.
interpret this correctly, we as a board can know the name and everything of the candidate
Once it's been.
once the superintendent decides that's the candidate and brings it forward.
Right.
Prior to that, we do not have,
You don't have a role in the process.
we have a
prior
role in
to
the
that.
process, so we cannot see that information.
There's no basis for you to see the information.
So
And so-
we rely on the superintendent to bring the best candidate forward, then we can review the information.
Right.
Yes.
And I think, I mean, honestly, I think for the superintendent, if board members, not saying everybody's gonna show up at the office and go look at them, but it serves as an additional check that she can gauge the opinion. If 4 or 5 board members come looking to say, not liking what I'm seeing, it prevents it from going further forward and causing embarrassment to that person and damaging
But
their
when is
professional
that?
reputation. Before
If
the
you
meeting.
go in to see, so from the time the consent say the board packet is given to us on Friday.
No, he's
No.
saying
No, no.
before that.
No,
Before
way, yeah,
that.
way before
He's
that.
saying, once the superintendent
Before Cheryl
says,
puts the name on the consent.
Right.
I
You
have
have-
made
She says,
selections,
"I
come
want-"
down and view them, Friday I'm putting the list together. Say Tuesday, she says I've made selections. You have from Tuesday to Friday to go down and take a look at it.
Or
And if you
quit your
don't,
job and become the superintendent.
Right.
That's where I'm struggling.
Right.
Yeah.
It's not
If
a
you wanna do
micromanagement
that, work
issue,
here.
it's giving Cheryl the ability, or the superintendent the ability, to be able to gauge, rather than when it goes onto the consent agenda, a board member decides to pull it out, we discuss it, it gets voted down. We could have avoided that entirely,
But
because
with-
people can have the.
But without being part of the process, how are you making that decision? That's what I was saying. Oh, that family name in Torrington? Like, how do you make that decision if you're not part of any process?
the other problem with that is those of us that are never in town, because we work far away from this town, we would have to pay some administrator to stay here to keep the doors open at night to give us this ability. You can't say it's only available between 7 and 5, because there's some of us that's not gonna happen. So now, if you make that a practice, you're going to have to figure someone has to stay to make that accessible. So,
Deb, you want to step?
just throwing that out, that's another consideration if we decide to make that a procedure. But, we agree, I just wanna get half of this done. We agree that the bargaining unit positions can stay as they are, the way they're currently in. Right?
But
As
that's
far
not
as,
what they're saying.
well, no, as far as
Bargaining,
bargaining unit.
No, because they're saying if a teacher's, they want to look at the teacher's resume.
But that's just a consent agenda issue. That's not, how we're gonna vote on them,
No, they're saying they want to have access to the resumes
But-
and applications.
but that doesn't change the way we vote on somebody.
Right.
That's your access to material, that's a totally different, once it hits, the superintendent makes a recommendation, it hits the consent agenda, we wanna vote on it on the consent agenda.
Right.
I'm just saying we wanna do that.
Right, but I don't agree that they're separate, because what they're saying is they want the superintendent to pick someone. Before it goes on the consent agenda, they want to look at resumes and have a conversation with the superintendent, whether this person should or should not be brought forward.
But we already have the right to view that information regardless. I mean, that's already, right? I mean, if
Ultimately,
she,
if you're gonna vote on whether someone should be appointed to a position, there's nothing foreclosing you from getting information about the finalists for that position.
So what liability do we have if they're going to bring someone forward and a board member comes in here, convinces the superintendent this person shouldn't get the job merely because of their name? Whatever reason they decide that they're going to tell the superintendent that they're not going to have enough votes to pass someone. To
Ultimately,
me, that
this-
seems much less transparent.
Right, ultimately, the district needs a legitimate, non-discriminatory basis to deny someone employment if employment's going to be denied.
like, for example, you can pass you could commit some type of crime at a business. They decide to let you resign and not press charges, and it would never show up in a background check. But you might, as a board member, have knowledge that that had gone on, and you can close the liability loop that way. Because we all have professional networks, everybody knows people around. I mean, Connecticut's a small state. But that would never show up in a background check because the business decided as long as the employee left, they weren't gonna press charges.
But if you're
But
gonna
that
look at
comes
it,
up, that should come up when you do your other personal references that they haven't
But I'm only
even
gonna provide you
listed.
references that are gonna make me look really good.
No, that they haven't even done. No, yeah, but no, you don't just call the references on the reference sheet.
Understood, it just widens that scope.
but from what I think Rich said, if she decides that's the person, it doesn't go on the consent agenda yet. Say we decide we can go and look at it. We can look at the person's name?
You look at everything.
Yes.
Which
That-
has already
that's
been
our
released
right.
on the
Ultimately, you're
agenda.
gonna be making ultimately an employment of a specific named individual. Right? I mean, ultimately, the board's gonna act on a motion.
But it's not on the consent agenda yet. She decided that's the candidate,
Right.
okay? Decided Chris, that's the candidate.
Right.
okay? Any board member who wants to come can come and look at the resume and anything else. They can look at the name? We can look at the name and everything?
Of that
Yes.
finalist, yes.
You can look at everything.
And they can
Because
have
it's a
conversations.
finalist.
Yes, because that's gonna come before the board.
But we
as an
can't look at
action.
anything else, any other
No.
people.
Right.
But that candidate we can look at, name, everything,
Because that's the person who's gonna come before you for final action. If you-
even though we're not part of the hiring
No, but you're gonna-
process.
But you're gonna vote. You're the
We're
only
gonna
way
vote,
to
we're gonna
appoint.
We're the
consent.
in-
Well, we're
step
the
of the
end, right,
process.
consent, but
You're
we're not
the-
involved in the,
Right.
We're involved in the
Individual.
most
That
important
is your
part.
role.
Right.
correct,
'Cause we
I'm
take the
saying that,
liability after
but
that.
what I'm saying is, we weren't involved in the interviews and
Right.
such, right, that's what I'm saying. But we can know name and everything,
Because ultimately, you're gonna appoint the person.
correct,
Yeah.
before it reaches anything, before a board meeting.
Yes.
It's not even on the consent agenda yet.
If the superintendent has made her selection in terms of a recommendation to you, and you're going to be asked to vote, should, Rich Mills be appointed as the principal of X, Y, Z school, you have the right to get information. Again, the board should keep it uniform. This is important. You should keep the information uniform and consistent in terms of the timeline, but the board has the right to get that information about that finalist.
So back to what
Oh, can I
Fiona was
follow up?
saying, so that could open us up if one of the board members decides, yeah, I really don't like this person, and goes out and,
Yes, if the board.
Talks about it.
If a board member does something that interferes with that person's current employment, or invades that person's privacy, or defames that person, yes, there could be exposure legally for the board.
Fiona?
And just so, does the board member also have the right then to discuss information about this specific candidate that they think may be true or possibly may not be true without this candidate there?
If the
Right.
board,
They get hired.
at the board meeting where the board's going to make a decision whether to appoint that person or not, the board would have the right to discuss that particular candidate in executive session.
I'm not talking about, I'm talking about when the person's in here looking at the application and they see John Doe. Oh, Cheryl, you can't hire him, I'm concerned about the individual communications off of what they're seeing off the application with things that might be true and might not be true about people.
A board member
I don't know,
could
to me it
have.
seems very underhanded.
A board member
Right.
could have a conversation with the superintendent, as you described. It would be important that board members not engage in communications about that candidacy outside a meeting, because that would create an FOI problem.
That's really, it was my biggest question, is our responsibility with that information. So
Is to-
we're clear
Right.
that this is discussed within board meetings or with the superintendent, and that's it, right? I mean, is that what we're saying?
Yep.
Because the thing that I'm concerned about is, it's a small town and a small state, like you said. There's no reason, and we certainly don't have the privilege to be able to just go into somebody's information and then go start talking out, like you said, at Stop and Shop, about
Right.
John Doe
Right.
is a candidate, and I don't feel like that person should be a candidate. That's
Right.
absolutely irresponsible.
Absolutely.
Right.
And you will also, as a.
Would you agree?
I have a right to say that, I have a right to say it at the board meeting.
Right, which I said.
Right, but I mean, why are we talking like nobody trusts anybody about all of this? I mean, has there been any history of information?
You're talking about
Andrew,
future
you
boards,
just
not
went through a
talking about this
diatribe
board.
earlier about
Yeah,
how
you
you
keep
wanna
talking
talk
about-
about all
Well,
kinds
I
of
mean,
stuff, and
Right, but I mean.
so that environment's
there's-
created by you. You're the genesis of that, so it's
No.
important that we define these guidelines.
Yeah, but I mean, I mean, I'm raising issues, you're actually concerned that there's some history
No,
within
he's
this
raising
board?
No,
issues
no.
of, remember, once you create a policy, it goes forward.
Right.
It doesn't go back. So whatever's happened in the past is irrelevant. You have to look forward. What if you get someone on the board that's not clear of that responsibility, and that person comes in here, reviews 42 different positions that are gonna be nominated, and is sitting at a cocktail party on Saturday and said, you ever heard of, Chris Rivero? I don't know, what have you heard about that guy?
Everyone's heard.
I just don't, I don't think that we can sit here and
Okay.
say that the
You ever heard of
superintendent,
Jeremy?
we should trust the administration, we should do that, and then you can in turn turn around and say that you can't trust the board members. It's disingenuous to make that argument.
Well, I think if the superintendent does something that you don't trust or you don't like, you can evaluate the superintendent. If a board member does something that exposes the entire board, we can censor them.
My concern with this, I have
But it's a
concern with
stern
it.
censoring.
Yeah,
Suppose that you have a future board where you have a very weak superintendent and you have a very assertive board member. And really, that one person then dictates the hiring.
Right.
Right, we're creating standard work,
I
guidelines by which we.
I would think
should
Cheryl
operate
would
in the
never
future.
Not
withdraw.
Superintendent.
All right, I would think the
Superintendent.
superintendent would never withdraw a candidate because there was only one board member that objected to it.
Right.
Well, it wouldn't matter
I
anyways,
really don't
because
think that
that
would
would be a whatever to one vote.
Well, the
anyhow.
board, in your scenario, the board, if you actually just had a board that was antagonistic to the superintendent, you would have an impasse. Because
Yep.
on the one hand, the board would never hire anyone, and on the other hand, the superintendent would be spiteful and never bring forth anyone that you would hire. So it's always in our interest to work with the superintendent. The reason why I talk in terms of creating these types of checks and balances, because that's what keeps a good relationship. Not just letting one person have more power than the other entity. The board should have an equal power to have a check on the superintendent, and the superintendent ultimately has a check on the board. I mean, we're all here to want to have a good education system, so it's not in anyone's interest to go and just try and, as she would say, micromanage everything the superintendent does. I'm only here wanting to make sure that superintendent knows we have power, and she's telling us she has power, and we have to work together. So you want to keep our policies in line with keeping that balance of power. I don't know why you feel like we're going to somehow go out of our way to hurt this district by...
I think repeatedly at board meetings, we've seen where people come to board meetings with hearsay, with no backup information to say if something's true or not. And quite frankly, that scares me that they would be in deciding who becomes a teacher in Norton.
When would you like for people to talk about things that come before them? When do you want them to? You want to have private conversations?
No, if you have
Or no conversations?
factual information
Right.
that is truth, that's one thing. But that is not what happens. You hear a rumor on the street and it becomes a truth in a board meeting with no backup documentation.
Well,
To me, that's reckless.
That's why